Hello everybody, time for another video. So as ever, I'm going to wing this a little bit. Sometimes I think about writing these out, which I might do for some later videos, but that can kind of make it stiffer. So kind of doing an impromptu chalk talk. And after being away from drawing with some important stuff to see to, I kind of started looking through various comics and things that I really enjoy, primarily Alex Toth's work. And it got me back to thinking about what's important in learning to draw, because as I've said in some of my other videos, it turns out, for good or bad, my channel is mostly oriented towards people who are learning to draw, and also fans and people who may be interested in the mechanics behind the scenes of how drawing works. Because it is kind of fascinating. I mean, I do it, but the reason I've done it my whole life is I find it endlessly interesting to learn about. So one of the things I said in one of my earlier videos that I realized really clearly when I was younger is that it's not enough to copy the outward lines of somebody whose work you admire, which is a natural tendency to do. But it's only one step. It's if you go to a deeper level, you learn that the sort of a more effective method is to try and reverse engineer the artist or creator's thinking that you admire. And for me, with Alex Toth, I admire his work not only because it just grabbed me visually, but when I got to know him more and study his work, I could see the kind of thinking that lay behind it. And it was really connected to the classical tradition of older artists and painters going way back centuries, which was a combination of emotion and reason. In other words, there's a kind of deeper understanding of the world. There's a very real thing that your perception and understanding of something is limited by your ideas. It's not just like you can look at something and understand it. There's sort of like a filter between you and reality, and that's your abstract ideas. And that conditions your understanding of what you're looking at. So the more knowledge you have, the more you can see in things, which is a very lofty thing to say, but it's a high ambition. But it really is true. So for example, bringing it back to drawing, the more understanding you have of what I'm going to talk about mostly in this video is structure. The more understanding you have of the inner structure of something, and also a related idea, its function, because structure and function go together, the more you can see in what you're looking at. And I'm going to use two examples in this video, which I hope will be helpful. And really all I'm doing in all of these videos is just pointers. I've said this before. Pointers of how to teach yourself how to learn, because in the end, you're on your own. You can have the greatest instruction, greatest books, set of books. If you don't know how to access the knowledge in them and teach yourself and kind of teach it to yourself, digest it yourself, then it's really useless. I mean, you can buy all the art instruction books you want. You can even listen to all the videos you want. Unless you internalize it and change your way of thinking and learn the tool of learning, not that much difference will be made, probably. That might sound a little brutal, but results vary for each person. But what I'm going to get at here is that it's not enough to learn the outward forms of things, which we tend to do. And it's not even enough to, if even further back, is just to copy the surface lines of an artist you admire, And for people who don't know Alex Toth's work, I mean, I'll flip through some of this as I'm talking about it. This is something he did later in his career called The Fox. And, but you see something you like, it might not be this for you, it might be more current artists. And you tend to copy the lines and surfaces. And beneath that, you might actually eventually read them, what is it called? The Marvel Way to Draw Comics. Do I have my copy on my shelf to pull out? It's around here somewhere, people. Here we go. How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, which is a great book. And it shows you things like form, which might be the next level. Understanding things about forms and thinking in form. This is about gestures. There's a lot of useful information in here. Here's like perspective as related to block forms, going into deep space, vanishing points, right? So that would be, the first level of learning. This is just my rough formulation, by the way. Don't take this too literally. I'm just yakking about the various ways you can look at this. But, a very beginner, like when you're a little kid, you just copy the lines, like you trace it, you copy it. That's okay. You can learn a lot. The next might be that you start understanding, oh, there's form. And, I've said this, many other people, I learned this from other people. There's 3D forms, okay? But there's an even further progression you can get to, which is that you start to understand after a while that your success in drawing is going to be limited by your depth of knowledge about structure and about things. Like, if you don't understand much about the forms and structure of, say, a car or, say, a skull, and you haven't internalized that, that's going to condition. It's going to be like a limiter, a brake. Like on an engine, there's a governor, a speed limiter. It's going to be kind of like that, because you're going to be drawing things that you don't really understand. I've used an example in another video of a fire escape, things, mundane things like that. And what you find is that there's a whole range of new ability that you can acquire in your drawing by understanding and studying structure. And that can seem very boring at first, frankly. Things I'm going to talk about here, I guess for some people might think, oh, that's really boring. But it's one of the secrets. Beginners always go, where are the secrets? The secrets are that people who can draw really well, like Alex Toth is a great example for me, they had studied structure. And he was writing about this all the time in articles. He did it in the article I published in Comic Book Artist magazine, where I interviewed him about craft techniques. And he did it in postcards that he wrote to me. And when I was younger, I didn't really understand clearly. I kind of got it, but I was like impatient to get to the drawing. How can I do the cool drawings, Alex? And that's how most people are. But he kept repeating things like study structure, study function, study silhouettes, things that seemed to me to be outside the range of the cool drawings. But it's only as the years went by that I revisit these things and I understand more and more of what he was talking about. Is that, I think he said, I'm paraphrasing, but if you understand the structure of a thing, you know it and can remember it forever and can draw it. He may have even gotten that from his informal mentor, certainly his idol, Noel Sickles. And Noel Sickles was a brilliant draftsman. But, when I look at these, for example, and this is going to be edging me back into what I'm going to be talking about, Alex is drawing suits here. But you can be darn sure and I can see here, this will relate to what I'm going to talk about later. And not later, not like hours later, in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about shirt collars and fire hydrants. Is there a connection between the two? You'll see. But, I can see when I look at this that I'm super zoomed in so you can see this, but he had studied coats, drapery. He understood the cut of them. All the things that might seem outside the realm of fancy drawing, because people, again, will say, don't bore me with all that crap, bro. That's too technical. Just let me go draw, unleash me. And you can do that, but you'll still be limited by the boundaries of your knowledge. And even if you're drawing science fiction things, very invented things, the more knowledge you have about the real world, the more you can take that and then build off that. Even someone like Jack Kirby, who was much more exaggerated than Alex Toth's style of drawing, when he was inventing all his crazy outfits and costumes and superhero suits and things, you could see that he had studied all kinds of visual material. He knew the basics of it. Like when he was drawing Roman legions in one of the comics he did, I'm trying to remember, but I think it was one of the New Gods comics maybe. You could see that he had studied all that stuff, or at least he knew it enough. He'd been looking at visual references of it enough to get the basics of it. And then build off that in cartoons. So again, these are like the secrets. See how see this here, that Alex has looked at hats carefully, how they sit on heads. He's looked at collars, how they which I'll get into in a moment. He's learned enough about the structure of things. I'll zoom back. that he can cartoon them effectively. Because if you don't understand the structure of a thing, you really can't go that far. You're going to be limited by your maybe very primitive concept in your own mind. And so as much as it might seem kind of very basic, the astounding thing that you can discover is that if you go back and honestly test yourself, you see that actually some of your conceptions, or many of your inner conceptions of things that you've seen every day, are very basic, and you may even misunderstand some vital things. And that's the astounding thing. You look at stuff every day and you realize that you haven't been seeing it. The thing is that whatever you've internalized as an abstract image of the world and of things in the world, that's going to be a limiter, like I said a bit earlier. So you have, like, number one, you have the world out there, and you have your conception of things in the middle, and then you have what ends up being your drawing. So if you can change your conceptions of things and elaborate them a bit more and get a deeper understanding of them, your drawings will then improve because you'll have much more flexibility. And that can be a struggle at first because you don't actually, at least I found this, that there can be a struggle to get to that internal part of your mind and change your concepts of things. And there's lots to it. See, look, here's structure. Structure's everywhere. I don't know if I've elaborated enough of what I mean by structure, but see, Alex is doing this goofy cartoon drawing of, who's it, Big Daddy Roth, I guess, and he's fallen over. But you see how he's drawing that, the belt there and the pants? He's put the structure in that there's this, on a lot of men's pants, probably women's too, I don't know. I don't wear women's pants, but I assume. There's a, to hold the belt, there's a kind of tab that's sewn over at the back. And then there's going to be the belt loops. Things like that, right? You might not include that, but those give authenticity and conviction. Or here, I'll zoom out so we can see. He's got the seam lines. The seam lines here. He's got, edges on the t-shirt. Little structure details, very nicely drawn too, the shapes that you would get. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next part of what I wanted to do here, which is I'm going to talk about examples. Now, if anybody is a drawing student and has gotten this far and wants to play along, what you could do actually is stop the video and draw me, I'm going to write it here. Stop the video after I do this. Oh, my pad's going away. Shirt. Collar. Just your basic men's shirt, collared shirt collar. Okay, so if you want to do this honestly, without cheating, I mean, if you go ahead and just keep going, it'll still be useful. But if you really want to do this right, in my opinion, stop the video, go and draw a few drawings, take 10 minutes. It doesn't have to be like hours. Do not research, though. This is the key part. Don't research it. Don't go look it up. Don't even look in the mirror if you happen to be wearing a shirt. Just what you're trying to do as an exercise is draw your mental image of what you think a shirt collar looks like. Okay, what you've memorized. Because that's the point, is to flesh out the difference between your mental conception of it and the reality. Okay, so, and again, this might seem very sort of mundane or drilling down into very deep basics, but you'll see the point. Okay, so right now, please go and do that if you want to. If you don't, I'm just going to keep going because there's going to be no pause in the video. But if you want, pause the video, and now I assume you're back. And probably what most people will have drawn is something like this. I see this all the time. They draw a shirt like this, even if they draw it this much. Right? Or some version of that. And, that's kind of where it stops. But really, actually, that's missing some nuance, and it misses the functionality. Because, like, if you look at this, how do you close this shirt? You see, you can't. A collared shirt is not built that way. There's actually a structure to it. And you might even have a simpler version than this, depending on, what you do. So here we go. I got this from the internet, and I had a basic idea, but every time I do these myself, I'm not pretending to be this paragon of virtue. I'm simply the messenger delivering the method. So researching this, each time I do stuff like this, I learn more. So here, up here, you can see the real structure is that you have an overlap, right? You have to be able to close the shirt, but not have it super tight. Like, how can you overlap this? You can't overlap that on that to close it with a button, because it would actually cinch it in way tight. One would have to go under the other. But shirts aren't built that way. They're built with an understanding of that you want to close it and end up here with this V. So there's this actual tabbed part. Let's go back to this. I'm going to redraw it. Right? There's this tab part that overlaps. And then you've got, my hand's wobbly. I haven't been drawing. It's old man wobble. It gets us all. So that's, it's not completely closed. You know, maybe you're closing it and you've got your, right? Actually, I've drawn it in reverse, so the button's on this other side. But anyway, regardless. And then you close it and you're overlapping this tab. I'm just copying this diagram, right? And you've got this. So that may seem, again, like you're a little fussy, but all these things matter, because really what I'm talking about is not only that you can memorize and learn how to draw a shirt collar, it's to illustrate the method of thinking that you delve into the reality around you and try and notice more and put it in your memory and your mind. And once you learn some of these things, you won't forget them, right? Especially when you put it in your head by drawing them over a few times, and you look at different photos, you look at people, you might draw yourself in the mirror, you might draw your friend or spouse or whatever. You know, there's any number of methods. You might sit in a mall and sketch people and look without being creepy. You put all this in your head, and then once you pass it into your permanent memory, you've got it in there, and you just don't look back. And then it envelops other subjects, and it becomes a way of thinking. And again, I'm trying to give beginners some of these hidden secrets that all the whiz-bang pros don't talk about. The more sophisticated pros that can really do great drawings out of their head. I remember a great example is, he passed away, but Kim Young-gi, the Korean artist who was famous for doing live demonstrations, he had an encyclopedic vast realm of wealth of knowledge in his brain, and that's how he could pull all this stuff out and improvise on it. So I didn't watch that many of his videos where he talked about it, but I imagine he would have explained that it's not just like a magic trick. There is a magic to it, but it's also that he has been building in knowledge. And you can do this any day, anytime, when you're walking around, even if you don't have a pen or pencil or paper, you can just kind of look at things and try and see new things that you didn't see before. So I'm going back to collars for a moment, and as I've been, that little ramble was about that it's not just about one thing like collars, which you may or may not find boring. It's really about anything, drapery, anatomy. And actually that reminds me to say that learning this kind of structure is not fully in-depth like an engineer would. I'm going to talk about fire hydrants in a second, but even with things like shirt collars, you don't have to know it to the nth degree. It's the same thing with learning artistic anatomy. You know, a surgeon that would be cutting into you and has to know extensively, and they study for years, and now it's being assisted by 3D and AI and all these things, but think of previous eras up till now, before those technologies existed. A surgeon had to memorize and understand the form and structure and function three-dimensionally of bones, muscles, all the different various tissues, organs, and so on, right? And they had subspecialties. But the idea is that they had to really understand those things to a great fine degree. Now, an artist doesn't have to do that when it comes to anatomy. You do have to understand some things about bones and skeletons and functionality, but not to the same degree. So it's the same thing with something like this. You don't have to know shirt collars as much as a shirt maker would, or a tailor, but you have to know enough about the structure and function, and then how that manifests visually, to be able to draw it interestingly and convincingly. And I'm saying over and over, the skilled artists, the Alex Toths, that's what they were doing. That's their secret. Let me go back to my pencil. So here, for example, we have This is like a drawing I got off the internet, but it's interesting in that it shows, you see, when the shirt, and there's an example down here. Let me see if I can show it. Yeah. These are photos I got off the internet before I did this video. I just grabbed a bunch. See here, when the shirt's open, you can see how it rolls from the outside. This part is flat on the outside, but it's rolling. Sorry, I'm too zoomed in. It's rolling from being like this to rolling here, where you're seeing here the inside of the shirt. And it's the same as what's being shown up here, is that you're going to go from, you know, you've got the collar and you've got the overlap, but sometimes, depending on the cut of the shirt, some of it rolls over like that, as was shown in that drawing there. And you're going to see the inside, and then depending on the type of shirt, right, you're going to see yeah, I'm just double checking that I'm being accurate here. Sometimes there's a line here too. Oops, a line. You might even get a pull depending on the anatomy, you know, from some of the but the point is that there's a structure here that if you just draw the shirt like this, like as if the collar just ended there on both sides, it's just completely fake. And people intuitively somehow know these things. That part I can't explain. It's kind of mystical. But it's like with any good drawing versus bad drawing. Like, why can you show people drawings and some generally will say, oh, that's more cool and convincing. I would maintain that underlying somehow people somehow know these things. Particularly, you could illustrate this if you really faked it, you know, super faked it and made a super bad drawing. People would start spotting intuitively the problems with it. Okay, so I'm almost through shirts here. Again, this is a photo illustrating what I showed up here in this diagram, which I thought was more clear. Again, you can see the tab. And this is a button-down shirt, so there's two buttons holding the collar down, which is a certain style. And here, there's a bit of shadows obscuring it, but the buttons are open, so we've got a much broader spread, but here the inside is not showing. It's not really rolling over. And I emphasize that these are just random photos I grab fairly quickly. There's endless photos. The idea is to distill down your understanding so that you have this kind of diagram in your head. And once you perceive what the structure is, like I said, it's kind of hard to go back, although you might have to repeat it a little bit until you internalize it permanently. So lastly, here's an interesting photo. It's unbuttoned further down. And like I said, the insides are rolling out on purpose. It looks like it's part of the style. And then you can clearly see, because he's kind of turning and twisting a bit with his weight on one hip and dropping the other hip, the pull has gone right up to these buttons. So even that gets into the realm of learning about wrinkles. And the more you study and look at photos with understanding, you start to see recurrent patterns that repeat over and over, and principles that work. Like, it's coming from the hip, there's a bit of twist in his upper torso, and it's pulling here. It's pulling down because, you know, the weight of the shirt is descending off the buttons, which are, you know, grab points, like pinch points. I'm going to get to part 2 in a second here, my next thing, but I'm going to look for, let's zoom out here so the people can see, my loyal viewers can see. Well, you know, here, there's endless examples in Alex's works. He cartooned it because he's done this with, probably outlined this, I would imagine, from what I know of his methods, thinner markers, and then he's hit it back in with thick, chunky markers. He told me in one of his postcards that I don't know if I've done a Toth card on that yet, but this is like an aside for the Toth fans. He told me that He tried the method of doing all the big chunky blacks first, but it never 100% worked for him. So he usually went back to outlining things with a thinner marker, and then, which is a more traditional way, like you step by step, outline the forms, and then start hitting it with more and more blacks, filling in the blacks. And you can kind of see that here, I'm guessing. I mean, I don't know 100%, but it looks like, say, in a panel like this, he probably outlined it all vigorously with his thin liner marker, and then he started hitting it with thicker markers, like on these beautiful wrinkles. But when he's doing this, he's aware of these principles I'm talking about, like the pull from the back. The man's arm is forward, or here you have these, I should use a pointer, these wrinkles indicating compression. Here's a very good example of compression, the zigzag folds you get. See if I can find some pull lines. I gotta zoom back. I keep forgetting people, forgive me. This is from much earlier in his career, and he had a sort of a different style. Oh, I like this drawing. Okay, this is a great one. I really love this sketch. So here you can see clearly what the stuff I'm talking about. See the pull lines coming from the button, the buttoned up button. See how he's drawn that this one is unbuttoned? So see that, and then the button's pulled away here. So see, those are very subtle things, right? But I think it's what's called a double-breasted suit. It's got buttons down both sides, the old style. But you see, he understands the structure, and this is what I'm talking about, is these nuances and subtleties, he's kind of been obedient to reality enough to, you know, build them into the drawing, and then he's made the drawing, the inking kind of loose. But underneath is that matrix of reality. And that gives a real strength and solidity that is not to be found anywhere in fancy tricks. You know, it's because he built in stuff like the way that the hips are shifted here. He's got the weight under the neck. You can't go past that. Like if your neck point goes past the outside foot, the person will start tipping over. He clearly knows all those things. And then he's just hit it with just chunky black things to give it that graphic vigor. All right, I'm going to go on to the last example of two. Oh, I can't show it. All right, if you want to stop again, here we are. If you want to stop again, draw yourself out, just straight out of your head if you're an art student or someone who wants to learn more about drawing and learn more about this principle of studying your own thinking and your own concepts, because you have to upgrade your own concepts. I'm reiterating again here what I said earlier. So when you draw, particularly out of your head with no reference, like someone like Alex Toth could do, you're drawing on, that's kind of a pun, you're drawing on your file bank of mental concepts, and those concepts have form, like volumes. Again, you know, volumes, but they also have structure, like the arrangement of things and the way that they function, like I was saying about shirt collars having tabs. So this can apply to anything, particularly the more functional it is with movements, like, and more complex, like something like a car has many parts, right? Whereas, you know, a solid object like this is just a model I made out of balsa wood 40 years ago of the rib cage. It has no moving parts, right? So it's just a solid object. But something like a human being has form, but it also has function and movement, so it can change. That's why humans are very difficult to draw, like a hand. It's got three-dimensional forms, but it can change into infinite forms, subforms, when it changes position, and then each one seen from different angles. So what you're trying to do here is, by this exercise, and you should always do any exercise you do, if you make ones up for yourself or do other people's, you should always understand the point of it. It's like a scientific experiment. If you don't have an understanding when you go into it, you won't get anything out of it. You should explain to yourself, why am I doing this? So here, the idea is that I'm trying to flesh out for you that you have abstract concepts in your mind, like a little dollhouse of the entire world in your mind, of visual, it's sort of visual and functional in terms of understanding and in terms of the forms and the relationships between these things. You have all that in your mind as a mini theater of the world. And so, when people become things like philosophers and they start studying ideas about, for example, the world or spirituality, what are they trying to do? They're trying to evolve their understanding with the hope of making it closer in accord. I would hope that this is their hope, that it would accord more closely with that of reality. So as an artist, what's very interesting is that you study things. If you take this kind of approach, the one epitomized by someone like Alex Toth and many, many other people, is you're trying to study the real forms out there and modify your own internal forms and keep them in your memory so that your little theater of figurines of the world that's in your mind, that you have it in your mind, and hopefully you can learn to turn it. You can learn to manipulate and change them. And that's what you're doing when you're imagining things in your mind's eye. That's what any artist is doing. So what I'm trying to do is this exercise is to get you to sort of test yourself and show it. So here, the next one would be a fire hydrant. Like, oops, I've smeared it. Spell it right, Paul. That was 1. This is 2. Now you can stop this video, please, if you want to. If you don't worry, I won't hunt you down. Stop the video, do your best drawing or two for 5 or 10 minutes, whatever, short, a sketch of a fire hydrant, and then compare it to what I'm going to show in a moment. When you come back, have a look. So let's look at what real fire hydrants look like. Okay, so I hope this is clear. As ever, I said that I do these things as direct videos to make them more efficient to produce. I'm not doing fancy edited cuts and things. So this is a black and white printout of a page I made on my computer of things I found on the internet. Now down here, for example, this is it's probably not going to show up that well because even in fact it kind of printed out fuzzy. This is a more complex, but I found it interesting arrangement of new knowledge, at least for me, of how this stuff works. The inner workings that you never think about. And I thought I had a reasonable idea after drawing Robot Dreams. We had to draw fire hydrants. I thought I had the basics, but actually, like on any of these things, it's really interesting when you can get yourself turned into this direction of studying stuff. There's a whole bunch more stuff I didn't know, and there's endless. I mean, I have zero knowledge compared to an engineer. But you see, what I'm saying is, as an artist, if you can advance your knowledge just a little bit into new realms, it can actually change, even if it may seem unconnected, it can change your final drawings quite a bit. You'll have a new solidity and conviction to them. So here, for example, this showed that underground, there's a whole structure to fire hydrants that I didn't really ever think about. I mean, who walks around thinking about, oh, I'm daydreaming about fire hydrants? This is the supply main, I guess the main feed line from the bigger city lines of water. It says that this is a valve box. So there's a valve here, and this is like the branch line that goes to an individual, this line to the individual fire hydrant. And in my other reading, I'm going to try and keep this semi-simple, but just this is an illustration that there's a lot of base knowledge you can get behind things if you really glom onto this principle. This is I was going to say there's apparently two kinds of fire hydrants, wet and dry. So dry would be that there's not routinely water in the actual hydrant, and that apparently is by far the most common. Wet would be that the water's always in there, but the info I read at least said that that would only be more common in warm climates like, say, California, or I imagine in the south of the world, the southern hemisphere, or at least the parts of it that are in the temperate and tropical zones, where stuff doesn't freeze in the winter, right? You don't want water in a thing and it's going to freeze and crack it. So these are built to turn on water supply. There's a stem valve, I think it's called up here, stem nut. There's a valve that runs through. This didn't really reproduce well, but see if we can get some of it to show up at maximum zoom. There's a screw thread here, and I'm having trouble seeing this myself. Basically, the idea is that you have this top part that holds down this, it's like a container that holds down the it keeps this central stem nut stable. And because you're dealing with a ton of pressure when this gets going, so that you can't have the thing fly apart, right? You've got these bolts or nuts, I guess, nuts and bolts holding this, I think it's called a flange together, that holds this cap on. Those are, again, very sturdy and chunky because you're dealing with a lot of power, energy, so it's got to be sturdy. They have a special tool that they undo this, and then there's 3 outlets, 2 smaller ones and a bigger pumper outlet. I think they said it was called. Now, this is my layman's artist's version of this. And then again, for the same principle, because of all the pressure coming up, you've got these massive nuts here that are holding, nuts and bolts that are holding this clamp together so that the whole unit doesn't go flying up from the water pressure. So that gets into structure and functionality, right? So another aspect that can come into it is that when you draw these things, if you're drawing realistic drawings, you get into recognition, and that is sort of a parallel tangent because all these things are interconnected. You can go into a study of symbols in cartooning. Like if you're doing cartoonier styles of drawing, what do you want? You want recognition. So if you're not drawing this in a very detailed, illustrative way, someone like Alex Toth was kind of in the middle. He was fairly realistic in proportions, but he wasn't like mostly doing Bigfoot type cartooning. But the simpler you make your drawing, the more, if you want recognition, you have to make it like a symbol. And that kind of got into an interesting thought for me is like, on anything, how do you reduce it? This is a good exercise to understanding even structure and function, is how do you reduce it to its most simple form? Like if I want someone to see a cartoon and say, oh, that's a fire hydrant, and recognize it, what is the simplest form of that? Now, I don't even know if I can do it. This is just me ad-libbing this, right? So if I draw just a rectangle, that's just a rectangle. We haven't got fire hydrant yet, right? And this is, I'm going to put this here, symbols. It's almost a separate video, but I'm permitting myself to branch out for a bit. Because again, in all of this, I'm trying to illustrate the thinking. So say I add this, and I'm doing this in a flat side view diagrammatic way. Well, that still isn't fire hydrant, is it? Now, what if I do this? Okay, that's something. Is it fire? Does that say fire hydrant when you look at it? If I showed this to someone on the street and said, what is that? They'd go, I don't know, bro, that's a waste container, you know? So then what if I go like this and start adding more bits? Is that a fire hydrant? Probably not. It's getting a lot closer though. And then what if I go like here and I do even just like this? I think probably, and you'd have to live test this. That would be an interesting drawing video to do. Particularly if I go like that and add more of these. And you see, I'm making it more and more complex, so it's moving more towards realistic, even though I have zero perspective. It's just a flat diagram. So there's 0 forms. But the more I do this, I think most people would now recognize that as a fire hydrant. You could add this base thing here, and then add some lines, you know, like this. Right now, I think we're well into the territory of recognition. Oh, that's a fine. I think there's some of them, yeah, like here, have a chain that goes, I can't see clearly, but I think there's a piece here and the chains are anchored, that these caps, when you undo these caps, the chains keep them from getting lost. I think that must be the function, right? So everything has a reason. So now I haven't gotten into the 3-dimensionality of it, but you've got a barrel, cylindrical type forms, right? And then you've got the, you know, like say a center line. I'm drawing this sort of pseudo crappy because, and you've got, yeah, another flange up here. And then you've got the actual nut, which I think is hexagonal, so you'd have 6 sides in that. And it looks like up here there's even an indent for some extra nuts that are holding on. Then you've got these bolts going around here. You've got this bigger, this is a fairly crude drawing, but what the hell, Paul? And so on, right? So that's like drawing it from a certain angle. And this is sticking out. And there's more to it here. There's more subforms. But again, what you're doing is you're studying reality. You could do this and go out in the street. I mean, I've done it. I've taken photos. I got my own photo bank of street furniture, you could call it, urban stuff, pieces of things, different sidewalks, cracks, objects, street lamps. We've got these iPhones now. You can build up your own complete file bank. And the more you look at these, the more you can retain it. So you don't have to end up drawing it as detailed as this. Excuse me, but the whole point, again, as I close out this video, is that if you make second nature this approach to reality, you might go to this degree of actually formally studying things, which is a great thing to do. It's more work. It can be very challenging. Doesn't mean you end up drawing that way. You know, you can see that even some very cartoony cartoonists, and actually Jack Kirby's a good example, but there's people who are even far more cartoony. You can see that they have this kind of understanding. It just doesn't completely manifest on the surface of their drawings. So even like, for example, the fellow drawing Asterix in France, if you know that cartoon, or Tintin by Hergé. Tintin, it's known in North America, but I grew up on a mix of European, British, and North American comics, so I love Tintin. I called it Tintin, you know, because my parents were speaking French. But that artist is a great example of, I shall maybe do a separate video. I don't have the books right here. Great example of very functional structural drawing, particularly in the backgrounds. But on the surface, you might look at it and kind of go, oh, that's kind of, you know, clear lines, ligne claire, it's called in French. And it looks sort of simple, I guess, compared to like super hatched North American Jim Lee type comics. But again, my great plea is that this kind of stuff is the base of art dexterity and ability. And it was commonly known back in the days where the pipeline for artists was much more that there was no internet and there was no cross-pollination of ideas, which can be very good in one way, but it's led to the rise of all kinds of people, myself included, although I'm a crossover person, but I was going to say myself included, all kinds of people who are self-taught, and they never went to any formal academy. They didn't understand the classical pathway. I was kind of on both, so I was mostly self-taught, but I was born early enough that I still was growing up in the time of, like any of us older artists, the time where the culture and the productions of artists was all steeped still in the remnants of this classical, much more linear pathway. And by that I mean, I'm trying to keep these things simple, because each thing I mention, of course, could be another whole explanation. But that means that in the older academies, they had a linear progression that widened out. So you started off, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe, from my understanding, they didn't make you jump straight into trying to paint or fully render. They taught you drawing, and then you eventually moved on to full painting and rendering. So even with drawing, you drew casts, like you drew fixed objects from different angles, and you learned to observe and see carefully and control and draw carefully. You learned basics of things like form, anatomy, lighting in a certain progression, with the idea that you can't learn everything at once. It's exactly like you don't take a student driver and put them on the biggest freeway. Like here in Toronto, we have the 401, one of the bigger highways in the world. I forget, at the widest, it's got like, I don't know, you guys look it up if you want to, please. But I don't know, 10, 12, 14 lanes in both directions going. It's like you don't take someone and just throw them there, because that's absurd, right? It's like taking a toddler, a baby that's newborn, and expecting them to go run a 5K. Like, it's the same with this stuff, is that you build, and it's the way of nature that things grow organically from simple things. They elaborate and they get more and more complex, like organic forms, and they unfold and they become their full selves in a series of stages. So it's like that with art knowledge. And I'm trying to illustrate here some of the methods that you can use, because a lot of us on the internet, we are by necessity self-taught, but you need to actually have an understanding of the way to do that. And you don't do it by taking everything at once in a scattered way. I mean, you can, there's a time maybe for just jumping around and playing. But if you want to really advance, you've got to sort of go back to some of these more beginning things and start tackling them one by one. And it's astounding how actually they can build up fairly quickly. Again, in the idea that in the older classical academies, you did a year or two of like cast drawing, and then you moved to live figure drawing with more movement. And then you might learn the beginnings of painting in gray tones, I believe, things like that. And you're introduced to color, paint mixing. The idea being that each thing, just like in driving, each thing you're adding is new stuff, and you cannot learn all of them simultaneously. Usually it's almost impossible. Nobody does that. So it's like in driving, you get used to the theory in the classroom. You might sit in the car and sit at the pedals, get comfortable. Then you might drive around in a secluded parking lot and learn to just control the car. And then you learn the instruments, and you learn the signs and the theory in the classroom. It's kind of like that. And then you might drive down some easier streets, increasingly complex streets and more challenging situations with traffic signs and so forth. Then you learn to merge on the highway. I'm remembering from years ago when I learned to drive. It's like that with this. So in a way, it's almost a matter of forgiveness, that if you're a beginner and you're trying to learn drawing and you don't understand this stuff that I'm saying, that you have to figure out a way to learn it in progressive steps. And you usually go back to basic things that you thought you knew, like your shirt collar, or you're like, yeah, I've seen a fire hydrant 4 million times. Why should I go look at that? Well, that's the very point, is that you need to learn to see in a deeper way, understand structure and function in a deeper way than you ordinarily would, than the average person would. Then if you can retain that, you can use that not only to, if you're drawing a realistic, say, fire hydrant, you can have a lot easier time of it if you understand the structure of it, because you can decode when you look at different photos. But you can not only use that drawing if you're doing that literal thing, but even if you're inventing things in a science fictional way, and again, you're exaggerating stuff. Again, I think of Jack Kirby and the New Gods and different things. Like, he wasn't drawing realistic New York City buildings, right? And all that. He was just making it up because that was one of, probably, I'm guessing, secret of his productivity, astounding productivity, is he wasn't sitting there referencing, he'd come up after staying up all night in the basement smoking cigars or whatever it was. I'm paraphrasing, but he wasn't looking, he didn't have time to look up reference for all these things, but clearly he had the kind of mind where he had a file bank, and he had built up all these different references, how to draw street lamps and New York City buildings, and even fire hydrants. And he did it with his own particular twist of style. Roy Crane is another great example that I've referred to, that doing Buzz Sawyer. Here, I'll pull out some Roy Crane for a second for people who haven't seen. He clearly had, see if I can find some good examples. He clearly used photo reference, and he even did instructional things. That here this is like he's drawing a rhino in Africa, but it's a cartoon. I'm at maximum resolution here, so I can't, enlargement, so I can't blow it up any bigger. And I'm just choosing these randomly, as you can see. Like he's referenced jungles and he's simplified it down. He's clearly studied African, what is it called? The veldt, the savanna. It's all that whole thing, is that one of the secrets to improvement in drawing is knowledge. And often artists, are people who, like, they hated the school indoctrination system, and I don't blame you, because they made knowledge boring. But if you re-grab onto it yourself, you sort of make it your own for your own purposes, you can turn the whole thing around and just acquire your own knowledge in your own ways for your own purposes. Like, see how well he did. This is a cartoonier style, so it may not be to the taste of people who love that Jim Lee, post-Jim Lee kind of Scott Williams super rendered hatchy thing, but look at how well the understanding is of the wrinkles, stretch lines. He understands about colors, like I was saying earlier. Look how well the lighting is done in that. Just beautiful. A tent at night. It's based on observation. And I'm going to do more on Roy Crane, you know. There's so much there. Principles of lighting here, shadows, light angle. Let's zoom back a little bit. I could wax enthusiastic, and I will, I promise. So, yeah, see the commonalities behind these different artists. It's not about the surface style, whether you like that or not. It's about that they understood these deeper things about the world and drawing, like structure, form, function, lighting, and on and on. And that was the classical approach to drawing, which if you're, again, I'm repeating, if you come up through the sort of modern internet thing, an observation I would make is that it's very narrow nowadays. You know, you have people that mostly, at least in the indie scene, it's kind of splintered, right? I guess this will be my real closing comment, coming up for an hour here. It's kind of splintered because you have mostly, particularly say in the Comicsgate scene, you have, and related scene, you know, you have a lot of superhero type things, not completely, but a lot. And that's even an extension off the North American market, which had gone to just mostly superheroes, compared to some other parts of the world like France, Europe, Japan. They had, or hopefully still do, a whole range of other kinds of comics. But in North America, you have superheroes, and then off that, even tighter branching of very much that kind of, I don't know the proper term, but Jim Lee, Scott Williams, Image Comics, 90s, I don't know, that kind of style. And I would make the plea that there's all these other interesting styles of cartooning and art, particularly if you want to develop. You may end up going back to that, but if you take a detour into some of this other knowledge and styles, it can do nothing else but then to help you greatly develop. And I was going to say that in the North American scene, you have other branches which are cartoonier, like if you look at the other kind of indie, like the progressive, maybe SJW, whatever you want to call it, the, you know, scholastic graphic novels for young adults and kids, you know, Dogman, and who are the people like scholastic first, second books. I'm thinking of people like Raina Telgemeier and others like that are very kind of, I wouldn't say naive, but they're very simple kind of cartooning. There's almost, that's become a whole thing of a stylistic, okay, it's wrong to call it a ghetto, an enclave, a sort of a bubble of this one approach. So you have almost these different compartments in the scene. And I would make the argument, although I got to think about this more and I can't really completely prove it, but it seems like they've become sort of sealed off. And they certainly seem to me in some cases to be cut off from this classical tradition. Like if you go back to maybe the 70s and even late 60s, when comics, in my estimation, were really booming, and you had all these brilliant people, but you also had new people coming in. You had the brilliant older people like the Alex Toth and Joe Kuberts, Nick Cardy, Neil Adams was one of the newer people, I guess, crossing over. But then you crossed over as the 80s went on and 90s. But you had this whole fertile thing of the newer people being connected back into the older knowledge of this craft lineage, classical craft lineage. And what seems to be happening, and again, this is just me, a rough intellectual sketch, is with the advent of the internet and the intense cross-pollination, but also isolation of the people, that the new people coming up are not going to schools that are steeped in these older traditions, and they're not necessarily looking at the older comics, even though they're all available on the internet. I think that's a regret. I mean, people can do what they want. This is just my commentary on it, you know? And these are just my pointers really for anybody who's wants to listen to me, who likes my art, who wants to listen to what I have to say. That's my encouragement. I mean, that's certainly what I've been doing. Is I took the advice of Alex Toth, who was kind of an informal mentor to me in his postcards. And he said, and you know, I damn well listened because I was like, this guy's amazing. How did you do it? And he said, drink from many wells. Don't just play the one or two keys on the keyboard. learn to play them all as well as you can. So he was advising, study art, music, poetry, storytelling, stories, movies, lighting, black and white photography. I know for a fact he was looking at all this stuff. And that to me that's the secret. That's the royal road towards greater ability. It's not in just obsessively turning in and just copying, if you like Jim Lee, copying Jim Lee drawings. That's not really going to lead, in my opinion, to that wider road. It's just going to be habit forming, and we all have to be aware and wary of those kind of ruts or easy outs, extreme habits. Particularly when you get some success, you get monetary success, you get people applauding you, and they say, oh, you're so great, look at that, do more of that, and you become known, and you end up sort of drilling in on this one things that you become known for, which is understandable if you're trying to survive economically, and particularly if you have more what you call wing loading, like in an airplane, the weight on the overall weight that the wings have to bear. If you have the wing loading of a family and dependents to support, you're going to be kind of cornered in. But that's against the idea of if you're trying to learn, and that's, if you're trying to learn, you're trying to broaden out and get ability, and then you can sort of specialize later. So that, in fact, may be why if you're still an amateur in that sense, all these terms, amateur, pro, what does it really mean? But if you're a person who's not relying on drawing to make a living, that, in fact, may be a freeing kind of thing, because you don't have this incredible pressure of your previous success pressing down on you to just keep repeating that. Again, that kind of thing is the subject of many more videos. I'm going to stop there, and I hope that this was useful. Me yakking for an hour, but the whole intent is to reveal thinking, my thinking, other people's thinking, and again, go and study structure. Understand what it means. Even look it up. What does structure mean? Any of these things. Define them to yourself. Explain things to yourself. Don't just take them as formulas, as fixed formulas. So if you like this video, please do share it, like it, comment if you wish. And that all helps. You know how the deal goes with the algorithm. And thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next video.